Okay, I think we're going to start because this is a very tight schedule and I don't want to waste too much time. So, welcome to you all. Thank you very much for making time to join us today. We are using this debate as a platform to launch the book that Ian Goldman and Mina Pabari have edited together. It's called Using Evidence in Policy and Practice. It's what we imagine is going to become a seminal text. It's based on 8 case studies done in 5 countries and in 1 region, the ECOWAS region. And it's a very interesting and compelling exploration of the nature of use in evidence. And it's framed around a behavior lens perspective that also looks quite deeply into the change mechanisms that arise from the use of evidence. Our program today involves a debate, which the South Africans in the room is very, very current. So there are some people who are unmuted. Not muted. If people can mute themselves, that'll be great. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an opening speech, which is going to be delivered on behalf of the Honorable Deputy Minister Siweya by Godfrey Mashamba, who's the Deputy Director General in the DPME. And then we've got a debate, people who are arguing for and against the motion that evidence has been effectively used to inform responses to the COVID-19 pandemic across Africa. So there's a for team and an against team. And then we're going to have an adjudicated intervention, which is going to declare one of the teams a winner. And you're also going to have an opportunity to vote and share your view on which case has been made most successfully. And then Ian is going to talk about the book and give us some update on some of the contents and how we intend using the book. And then we're going to move to close. To move proceedings along, can I invite Mr. Godfrey Mashamba, DDG at DPME, to present the speech on behalf of Deputy Minister Siweya. Over to you, Godfrey.
Hello. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting the department in this session. As I said, I'm making this speech on behalf of the minister. I will read what is in the speech that she has approved. My name is Godfrey Mashamba, the Deputy Director General responsible for evidence and knowledge systems in the department of the DPME. I greet colleagues at CLEAR, the authors and the speakers that are enlisted this afternoon to speak in this session, and all protocols observed. I'm very happy to be opening this event, which is the launching of a book from CLEAR, Anglophone Africa, on using evidence in policy and practice, lessons from Africa. And what better way of doing this than applying to this existential threat to all our countries from COVID-19. So the question is, how are we going to use evidence to address this threat? Not just in the health field, but also for our economies, our societies, and our state of mind. This pandemic has presented all of us with tough choices. I think everyone will agree to that. Although we are faced with these challenges, we are expected as authorities to make some choices, because not doing anything is not good enough. Authorities around the world had to act quickly and efficiently to protect lives and livelihoods. The capacity of many governments have been challenged by this crisis from the onset. And to come up with appropriate responses to the outbreak authorities require evidence, which is why we are meeting this afternoon. Our experiences in South Africa show that the pandemic provided the opportunity where we need to use evidence and also a motivation to use evidence as such. Because COVID-19 is still an evolving phenomenon, its changing character and associated implications for health system, the economy, and social systems need to be monitored carefully and better understood. How can we use evidence to minimize the risk of the virus spreading, minimizing the risk of serious consequences when infected, and how do we manage the control measures in a way that does not destroy the economy? And what can we learn from our African experience? These are important questions for this session. Much of the work around using evidence to inform policy and practice comes from the developed world as we know it. We welcome this example of lessons that we can share from Africa. So this book is actually a very big contribution in the developing world. There are some very practical lessons we can draw from the book itself. So I must congratulate the co-authors for having come up with this book. Our responses have to fit the external and internal context. In South Africa, people living in large houses and in big spaces can easily self-isolate very differently to people that live in informal settlement. So we provided some areas where people, in our government response, we provided some areas where people from informal settlement could quarantine because we acknowledge those kind of differences in the society. There has been a demand for evidence, a demand from national government, that is, represented by government, the National Command Council, national departments, provinces, the research community, even the civil society organization. They require evidence to be able to take positions in their national discourse on how the country can effectively respond. Ordinary citizens also require evidence. So there is demand for evidence. In terms of generating evidence, there has been rapid response to assemble existing evidence around the pandemic in South Africa, around the experiences of the first world countries to face the first countries to face the virus, and the University of Johannesburg has played a key role in a consortium to provide access to evidence around COVID in Africa. The Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation is also assembling evidence to track the developments on a quarterly basis and has partnered with the Government Technical Advisory Center, GTAC, and the National Research Foundation to produce what we call a country report on COVID-19, involving a network of researchers across the country. This process also involves all the provinces. What about the measures to encourage the use of evidence? We see a wide range of forums being organized by government, provinces, universities, and civil society to increase awareness. This is important because everyone has to be aware of what's going on. Governments have created expert advisory groups to increase awareness within government itself of the likely outcomes and the implications of policy choices. This also helps to build trust within government in the use of evidence and in the practitioners and researchers who build models to draw on evidence to provide recommendations to governments. Data capability is important. In South Africa, the data capability has been developed, bringing together key institutions such as Statistics South Africa, the Council for Scientific Industrial Research, CSIR, to track the phenomenon of the epidemic. These are just examples. There are more actors in this space, and we have seen these numbers increasing. Government has also had to build its capability to use evidence, and we see departments assembling evidence like never before for all the choices that are having to be made at all levels. be it at national, provincial, or at local level. At another level, the capability that has been established enables South Africa to collaborate in international platforms for monitoring of the pandemic. This is just one of the examples where engagement by people in South Africa and the rest of the world and across the continent share knowledge about their understanding of how evidence is being used to inform responses. International platforms and exchanges are important because they advance solidarity across countries. They also promote learning across nations and continents. Will this evidence be used, the evidence that's being generated? Well, firstly, it is being considered. We have to be realistic, though, that there are hard political choices that government has to make to invest here or close there, deploy the police here, there, something like that. They have to take account of political realities, not just what is theoretically the best. So evidence sometimes has to be balanced against a political considerations as such. The lockdown we undertook early was in response to the evidence. It was indeed a hard choice to make, but it has to be done. We have undertaken a facelifting of the lockdown to minimize the damage to the economy, while recognizing that from the health perspective, it may have been better to continue with the lockdowns. But choices had to be made anyway. There was evidence that could influence either decision to extend the lockdown or to lift the lockdown. So this book and the debate that will come with it provides such a fertile time. So how can we make the best decision from the future of our country based on the evidence that is being generated? I look forward to hearing in the debate how you perceive it from the different African countries and all the other participants in the panel. And we can all learn from each other's experiences. We need to learn how to use evidence better now as we begin to recover from the pandemic. Are we recovering from the pandemic or not? Evidence should tell us that. But also what we should do differently going forward with regards to using evidence. We need good evidence. We need government to use that evidence, and we need wider society to hold us to account as governments in that regard. Aluta continua. I wish you a great debate. Thank you very much. Just on my own note, I have had a sense of what the different chapters of the book entail, and I had a brief discussion with Ian. Having taken up the position at the DPME, it was a very important gift to hand over to me, to learn about what knowledge he has of this area, for me to quickly read and understand, have a sense of how evidence is being used in the African continent. So I am very thankful for that, and I congratulate him and the authors of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great. And I really enjoyed your last point, which is that this is something we need to learn to do. And whether or not we've been doing it is interesting, but we need to continue to get better at it. So thank you very much. And thank you for stepping in at short notice following the Deputy Minister's unavailability. We really appreciate it, Godfrey. And we hope that we will continue to get to know more of you and that we can collaborate with DPME on a whole range of different things. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Elia Zulu, who is going to be adjudicating our debate. Just to give you a little bit of background on the man who's going to be making this very momentous choice. He's the Executive Director and founder of the African Institute for Development Policy, AFIDEP, AFIDEP's mission is to institutionalize a culture of evidence-informed policy formulation and implementation in Africa. He has a PhD in demography from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree in population and development from the Australian National University, and a Bachelor of Social Science from the University of Malawi. Siweya has worked in development and managing research, capacity building, and policy engagement. And he's worked on issues as diverse as population change, family planning, adolescent, sexual, and reproductive health. He's also currently steering a continent-wide program to enable African governments to optimize the demographic dividend. I'm going to hand over to you now, sir, to give some guidance to our debate teams. Over to you, Siweya.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Dugan, and everybody. I'm really very, very honored to be part of this debate, to be part of the book launch. Congratulations to Ian and Mine for the really wonderful book that is for the first time put on the table evidence on the difference on that evidence used in government actually makes in improving programs. So the debate, my job now is, again, I think I should thank the organizers and for giving me this honor to be the judge in this debate. And I'm gonna try to be a very, very strict judge. So to get started, I just want this time I'm here just to give you some sort of guidelines on how the debate is going to unfold. So after I speak these opening remarks, we are going to invite the two people who are speaking for the motion on whether evidence is being used effectively in decision making regarding COVID-19. They'll be given 5 minutes each. So we have two people, Mr. Kwabena Boke and Mr. Tim Rubanga, who have already been introduced, who are going to speak for 5 minutes each in support of the motion. And then we are going to have the pair who are speaking against the motion, Mr. Mohammed Awe and Ibrahim Fakar, who are going to speak against the motion for 5 minutes each as well. And then after that, what we're going to do is we'll give 15 minutes to open the floor to the audience, for the audience to give their own views. But because we can't really get an opportunity to give people an opportunity to speak, these views will mostly be extracted from the chat box, and from there, then we will. These will be questions and responses from the floor, from the chat box, and then some of them will be responded to as we go along. And after that, after the input from the audience, which will take 15 minutes, then we will then give each of the debating teams 5 minutes, but 2.5 minutes each to give their the summary, their closing argument. So we'll start again with the 4 team for 5 minutes total, 2.5 minutes each, and then we will go on to ask those speaking against the motion to also speak for 5 minutes. So the question basically that the group speaking for will be answering is, why would you argue that evidence has been effectively used to inform responses to COVID-19 across Africa, asking them to provide real-life examples. And then the against team will also speak to the question, why would you argue that evidence has not been effectively used to inform responses to COVID-19 across Africa? So that's how the debate will be. And at the end of after the closing arguments, we'll then do a poll by all of you in the audience to do a vote on which side you think won, or which side you are on in the argument itself. And once the results will be put on the board for everybody to see, once that is done, I'll then come to deliver my judgment on which side won the debate. So that's how the debate will go, and I turn over to you, Dugan, to take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just to remind you, the 4 team that's arguing in favor of the motion is Timothy Lubanga. Timothy is a commissioner of M&E in the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, and his colleague is Kwabena Boakye, who works in the Chief Directorate in the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation in Ghana. And I'm going to hand over to Tim to start. And I'm going to be timing you, Tim, so don't steal anybody's time, okay? Starting now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dugan, Chair, and Elia, and all the colleagues who have joined today. Greetings from Uganda to you all. So I'll go straight to the to propose the motion to support, and I will start with 4 points on why in support of this motion. Of course, sharing the Uganda experience. And as you know, as you might all be aware, Uganda has had a fairly successful experience so far in dealing with the pandemic. To date, the latest figures show that the total number of persons who have been affected is 1,500. And of those, 1,442 have recovered. And only 13 have passed away. Most of those in the very, very recent weeks. And many of those that have passed away, actually, it was only discovered they had COVID after they had died. Many of them were not handled in the facilities designated by government for COVID. But let me dash to my point so that I don't lose my time. So the first reason for advancing the argument that evidence actually was used in the Uganda COVID response was because the first decision that was taken when the pandemic hit the world was to start preaching the message. The Ministry of Health, of course, took center stage, and a national task force was established. And the first activity was to start educating people about the behavior change and how they should conduct themselves personally. Now, for me, that was exactly the first opportunity to use evidence, because this is based on researched and known facts for a long time that a pandemic of this nature, with this high level of being infectious, should be responded to in the following ways. So the first step, actually, to use evidence was the decisions that government took to start a campaign led by His Excellency the President himself on social distancing, on hand washing, on wearing of masks, on general behavior, on avoiding movement in public places, and so on. So in my view, that's the first example of the use of evidence. The second is a decision to lock down. Now, as you know, in many countries, lockdown came at various stages. Some took longer, some immediate lockdown. In the Uganda case, as soon as the first cases were established, a lockdown was passed. And in fact, the president, in announcing the lockdown, made reference to the Bible, and he made reference to biblical times when people who were sick, who had leprosy, had to be segregated from the community, from the rest of the community. And he also referred to the experience of the Spanish flu. So this is all evidence that existed already on how to deal with, on how to handle a pandemic with this level of infection. So, and with as infectious as COVID. So again, that is evidence. But the point again to make here is that many countries relied on advice from the WHO. And the WHO was probably providing advice basically based on research and many, many years of documenting how to respond. The third point, as I speed up, is in our case, when eventually we were faced with the challenge, there was a lockdown, the country was increasing the testing, a national task force was put in place. Now we started looking at the data, and the data showed that all the positive cases were coming from persons traveling to the country from outside, from other countries. So therefore, it was evident that the disease was being imported, and it was imported through the main border points, in our case with Sudan, with our neighboring countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and so on, but also through the airports. So beyond just the lockdown being formed by known evidence, the data that was coming through guided government in understanding, okay, where are the risk spots? Where is the danger coming from? Where should we put our energies? And so again, emphasis, so the testing facilities at the border points were increased, tracking of contacts was intensified, and many, many other measures were put in place. Now, again, that is taking a decision based on the data, based on the evidence that is coming from the ground. And then also in terms of monitoring, after 2-3 months of lockdown, we discovered that there was a certain section of the population, just like Dugan, you said at the beginning of the remarks, and also the opening remarks by the minister. There are certain members of the population that were really, really hard hit by the lockdown, because these are people who survive on hand to mouth. You know, they survive on the daily income to buy the food for that day, and they survive for that day. And it was evident that they were not able to cope with the lockdown. So a quick study was carried out to understand how best government could support these people. And it was agreed that we should distribute food. And so that is exactly what was done. Finally, I see I'm running out of time. The National Task Force, after 3, 4, 5 months now in the period of the pandemic, decided to look at the economy overall and see, okay, so what is priority, what is critical, what should government focus on, and what can wait, and so on. So in our case, the economy was divided into what they call a real economy and the other economy. And the real is what is inevitable, and that is industry, manufacturing, agriculture, health, and services such as power, water, those cannot wait. But the others, churches, prayer, sports, leisure, tourism even was sacrificed as the other. And so the focus now is the real economy. Chair, I think I've utilized my 5 minutes, and those are the points that I would like to share with the members. In our case, demonstrating that evidence was used and very effectively used, and the results show on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy. You did indeed use your time. In fact, you used Kwabena's time, which is actually handy because he has, I think, fallen off the call. I don't know why, but I assume there's a data problem where he's based. So Kwabena, I think you're not here, right? So I think what we're going to do is move over to the against team, and just to indicate that we've got a substitution. So Stella Kwasi will be joined by Ibrahim Fakir, who is the program director at the Our World Socioeconomic Research Institute. And I'm going to hand over to Stella, who is based at the Institute for Security Studies. And your time starts now, Stella.
Thank you, Dugan, and thank you everyone else for joining us. So I am arguing that evidence has not been effectively used in Africa. So I just want to acknowledge first that there are varied COVID-19 landscapes in Africa, and there's not a single or clear African trajectory. So just to keep that in mind while we have this discussion. But from the onset, when we found out that COVID-19 was a thing that was happening in China, and then to Europe, and especially in Italy, I would argue that Africa had the opportunity of time to sort of set itself up. So from the perspective of identifying what the problem is, coming up with how it would respond to the crisis if it eventually reached Africa, and what the impact of that would be, I would say that we have not, or rather African governments have not quite taken advantage of that opportunity. So from the word go, African governments were still allowing international flights without proper mechanisms to test or even isolate and quarantine people and do all the contact tracing work that was needed during that time. And we all know that that is how the virus actually got onto the continent, because of international contact and no mechanisms put in place to ensure that that would not happen. I'm going to give the example of Kenya, which let in a plane of about 250 Chinese who are not, their records were not taken down. There was no clear indication of where they were going to quarantine or isolate, and there was just no way for government to trace where they were. So that was our first mistake, allowing international flights when we were seeing what was going on and knowing how the disease was spreading on the continent. Secondly, once that was in, although a lot of governments have done a good job talking about the virus and giving regular updates, I don't think there has been like proper and coordinated messaging of what people should do. And even when that has been available, it has seemed that the message has been focused on people living in urban areas and not necessarily the rural people. We would know that this continent has experience in dealing with other epidemics. Ebola, for example, it's not the same as COVID, but there are so many similarities that we could have borrowed from those situations in those countries. And so I think, again, that's a missed opportunity where we've had information coming from the top and not engaging enough with communities to find out what they're thinking and what kind of solutions they have, as well as borrowing from other nations. But beyond that, after the disease is with us now and moving on, the measures and the contingency plans that have been carried out have very much mirrored what was happening in the West. And although generally speaking, those are sensible, measures to undertake, they just don't take into consideration Africa's unique context in terms of our demographic structure, our disease burden, and living conditions. So I'm going to give the example of our disease burden. Africa has a very high communicable disease burden. And I'm going to give the example of HIV and AIDS, for example. There are about 38 million people in the world living with HIV and AIDS. And during some of the measures like lockdowns and stuff, we had people not being able to access their antiretroviral therapy drugs because of those movements. So we didn't quite think through how lockdowns and certain measures were going to impact upon our other responsibilities within the healthcare system. I think, is my time up? Okay, one last thing. I think we've also had contradictory policies. So for example, in South Africa, the government, I think under level 3 lockdown, it was restricted that you were not supposed to have guests over at your house, but gatherings of up to 50 people were allowed. And so it's just like, what is going on? What kind of, there's just no logic to certain policies. And so if you're still gathering, it means that the spread is still going on. And so I think just having logical type policies would make more sense going forward.
Thank you, Stella. And I'm very grateful to Ibrahim for joining us at such short notice. And let's hear what disruptive things he has to say.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. Thanks for thinking of me, Dugan, in your hour of need. Of course, that's when you know how important someone is to you, if they think of you in their hour of need. I'm very appreciative to be here, and obviously congratulations to the authors. I'm unaware of anyone bringing out such a well-researched book. I've perused through it very quickly in such a short space of time. Now, this is a debate, and this is a debate about public policy, so I don't want to run this or approach this as a high school debate. So I'm not going to do this simply to score points or to win the debate. And in so doing, I'm going to concede that evidence, or the use of evidence in decision-making and in public policy making, was in evidence. But the question we've got to ask is whether the use of evidence was for a clear responsiveness to a public policy or a health crisis and problems. And to that extent, there was the use of evidence in decision-making by scientists and by public servants. And I would say much less so by politicians or those who are incentivized to make decisions on public policy, but who hold the political legitimacy to make such decisions, because those people make decisions on the basis of what is in their interests and what incentivizes them to continue to maintain or to capture or to recapture political power, because that's their purpose. So the question of whether evidence is in use is, in my view, a moot one. The question we've got to ask is who has used the evidence and in what way? And in that sense, I would argue that scientists, bureaucrats, people in the public service or the civil service have used evidence very well, provided good advice, but the politicians have unfortunately not always made decisions on the basis of evidence. So can we then say that evidence was used? I would say it was used in part, but largely it was abused. And I'll tell you in what ways I think evidence was abused. But before I get to the point of whether evidence was abused and how it was abused, I have to make the point that, look, at best, the quality of evidence, the character, the nature of evidence that is available to you informs the quality of the decisions which are being made. And the nature and quality of evidence which is available to us across the continent, including in well-developed countries like Kenya and South Africa, or relatively better developed countries like Kenya and South Africa, the basis of evidence is in fact quite weak. So if you go around to any number of municipalities and ask them for the extent of poverty, unemployment, or even indigence, because they meant to have an indigence register, you're very unlikely to get the kind of quality, the data, the precision, and depth of the data that you actually require to make good decisions. So there is an inherent basis and a disadvantage in the starting point, which then means that the use of evidence is at best inconsistent and sometimes uneven. So it is inconsistent and uneven. Now, why would I say that the evidence has in some instances even been abused? Well, if evidence was so well developed and well used in decision making, how is it that when the lockdowns started to happen, which is where I concede evidence was used to make a good decision, why then were so many people left out of any of the benefits and advantages of the wide-scale welfare programs which were rolled out? So, for example, on average, people who were indigent and who required assistance in the first period of lockdown waited between 8 to 10 days for the delivery of food parcels, which tells you that evidence wasn't in fact used, because if evidence was used, governments and public servants and those who are responsible for doing this would have known what to have done. Secondly, if evidence was in such great use, how is it that the frontline health workers were complaining about the lack of personal protective equipment? So PPEs were not available to the very people who actually needed this. Now, if a diagnostic around the distribution of procurement of public and personal protective equipment is so necessary, such a vital function cannot be fulfilled without it, how is it that these people didn't have access to it if the evidence was used to such a great extent? Third, the way in which lockdown decisions were made and the way in which states of disasters, or in other cases, states of emergencies, were declared, found that the application of these needed to be tweaked in certain instances because the nature of the demographics, the nature of the spatial location, and the nature of density and other social cleavages didn't lend themselves to a blanket approach. So while the spirit of the rule can be equally applied, the application certainly needed a degree of relativity, which was not, by the way, in evidence. Fourthly, if evidence was in such great use in the way in which public decisions were made, why was there such variability in the way in which the decisions were made? So at one moment, schools were going to open. To Kenya's credit, of course, they closed schools very early on. In other parts of the continent, it was true too. But there are other larger parts of the continent, including South Africa, where schools were either going to be opened and then closed, and then reopened and then closed again. And so there was no certainty about this. The same was true for large parts of the economy or certain sectors, particularly in the services sector. The services sector was completely badly hit, but that's largely where a large number of Africans are in fact employed across the continent. And so the variability of this application was, in my view, evidence insensitive rather than evidence sensitive. And then lastly, if we had so much evidence, why is there no use of this for the prosecution of maladministration and sometimes even outright corruption in the procurement which has been available under states of disaster or states of emergency for the way in which public procurement occurs? So there's apparently all this evidence, but none of it is actually used in order to ensure a culture of accountability and responsiveness or a culture of consequence. So in conclusion then, I would have to say that evidence, while it may have been in use, was certainly not in use to the extent that we know and have sufficient knowledge about testing, tracing, and tracking of the disease. And therefore, we don't know enough around transmission of the disease. And if this were the case, if evidence was in such great use and was not politically incentivized, I think we might be seeing very different public policy outcomes than the one we are currently seeing at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. So what you're saying is there's no evidence of evidence, correct?
In part, or at least there's uneven use of the evidence, or in some cases, the abuse of evidence.
Okay, good. So very compelling argument. I'm going to invite some of the people who've made comments in the chat box to speak directly to their comments. So I'm going to ask Marie Gurney, Donelli Mwachi, and Eda Khan to maybe just speak to their points. And anybody else who would like to make a point, please raise your hand in the participant list and I'll give you an opportunity to speak. Can I invite you, Marie?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Yes, great. Thank you, Dogan. I think the question around evidence is for what agenda, or what is an agenda which is driving the use of evidence. And I think that's what we've been struggling with COVID, but other issue. And that's really where setting the vision and the objective before we use evidence is very important, because it is used very clearly and transparently. And that's also make the understanding of the public clearer about what are we trying to achieve and what is evidence saying about what we're trying to achieve. And there's been confusion about the objective around the COVID measure, I think.
Thank you, Marie. Donnelly, would you like to make the point you've noted in the chat box? Oh, Donnelly says he has a microphone problem, but his point is, was evidence used? But to some extent, but in most cases, it was reactive rather than using evidence to prepare in advance. And this was, and I would guess he's also arguing, is the practice in so many African countries. Eda, would you like to make the point you've raised in the box?
Yes, thank you very much. Joining in from Kenya. I was just pointing out on both South Africa and Kenya and the references that have been made. So I felt that some of the people who have contributed to the evidence use are the citizens themselves because of their advocacy for change. For example, in Kenya, when the plane landed with around 300 people, it was the citizens themselves that almost demonstrated, maybe because of fear, yes, but insisting that there should be change, that the people should not be allowed, there should be restrictions. The same case as when there was harassment from the police, it's the citizens themselves who really advocated for changes, and this even reached the president, who was compelled to apologize and to make changes. So what I'm saying is, yes, evidence has not been used, but the citizens have played a lot of big role in terms of enhancing that use of evidence up to where we are now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eda. Is there anybody else who'd like to throw their opinion in the hat?
Can I just add something, Dugan?
Yes, please do, Stella.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, again, we don't have any existing, or at least a lot of African countries don't have any existing review or synthesis centers to support decisions being made, especially by our health ministry. So at best, the health ministries are collaborating or are hearing from universities and other medical research institutes. But we are at a point where I think we've seen this in Nigeria, in Kenya as well, where the governments get antagonistic when some of these institutions then come forward to, you know, throw in their opinion and tell people what's happening. And we have seen them getting defunded or, you know, some other type of punitive actions being taken against them. So again, it's a case of do governments really appreciate evidence, or you know, do they even want to use that evidence to make the situation better? One last thing is that, you know, the lockdowns and some of these measures, at least in my mind, they were meant to buy time and create greater capacity for our health systems. 5 months down the line, nothing has happened, at least not in, you know, in the majority of African countries. If anything, we are hearing stories of politicians getting ICU beds in their personal homes. And you're just like, what? Why is that even happening? And all the money that is being got from IMF and all of these places to respond to COVID, then, you know, getting sort of into people's pockets. So makes you wonder if they're even interested in evidence to begin with. Thank you.
Dugan, excuse me. So as a judge, I'm a little bit concerned here. Is Stella making her closing argument, or is she reopened? Have you allowed her to continue because she's a debater, right?
Okay, I'm out of order as a governor, and my apologies, Stella. You're going to have to save your comments for your closing address. I see there's some very interesting comments in the chat box. So I see Thevan Naidu, Erin McCandless, Maria's got another point. Would any of those people like to maybe speak to their points? Thevan? You've talked about the school nutrition program, which I think is a very interesting case.
Yes, yeah. So my thing is, you know, it's hard to navigate for and against because the evidence was there. But in terms of change, if we're talking about real change or drastic change, why is it that these policy shifts were only instituted when there was this hardcore taking to court of, whether it's by civil society or even by big corporates, only when there was the use of the courts? Why then do policymakers then lend an ear?
I think a lot of people on the call won't know what you're talking about. Do you want to just give people the tiniest little bit of background?
So for instance, with Section 27, they had to take the school nutrition program, which is part and parcel of our welfare program, using schools, school learners to access a meal a day through the schools. Now with the lockdown, schools were shut down, so we increased the level of child hunger. So it was only when they took this to court, then the Department of Basic Education starts saying that the program will then be reinstituted. Then with big corporates, then they take the cigarette and alcohol ban to court, then there's suddenly a change and lifting of restriction. Why does it have to be at that level of change, the use of litigation, for instance, to make change happen? Because it's long drawn out, it's expensive. Why can't people's voices be heard and used?
So I guess what you're suggesting is that there are things that change decisions, but they're not always evidence. And I think there's also an interesting couple of comments in the chat box on the nature of evidence. Erin, do you want to speak to your point?
Oh, there we go. Am I on mute? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, thank you.
Okay, super. You know, I've still got it a little bit muddled in my mind, but I've been doing some research across countries and identified 9 success factors that tend to be common across a lot of the evidence arising in different studies that have been done. And mostly the term science-based leadership is being utilized, not evidence-based necessarily. And I do prefer the term evidence, but this conversation is extremely interesting, but it's raising a lot of questions for me too around, you know, how do we vet evidence? And I think that would even help it be more inclusively owned throughout government and have more accountability, you know, and helping to move away from what Ibrahim is kind of suggesting, that it's used here and there and by whoever wants to. So yeah, it's just, I'm fascinated by the conversation. Thank you.
The cry of 2020, you're on mute. Is there anybody on the floor who would like to make a last point, or can I hand over to our debaters for their closing statements? Okay, Tim, how about you? Do you want to make share your final thoughts?
Okay, thanks, Dugan, and thanks to all the participants who have made very good arguments. I think there is general consensus that if I get lots of the comments and also my own reading of the discussion and the points that have been advanced, that the evidence was there in many instances, and I think there is variance. I think in debating this, we need to look at the variations in the countries, in the sizes of the economy, in the level of response, and so on. I think we need to appreciate the variance. But I think there is overwhelming agreement that there was evidence, and there was a lot of use of evidence. However, the extent to which this was successfully used to deal with the pandemic varies. And I think the point made that scientists, for example, in terms of, for example, advising on what measures to take, what are the policy recommendations that should be implemented, how do you deal with controlling the infection, flattening the curve, tracing of contacts, increasing testing, management of cases, and so on. There's a lot of excellent work that has been done there, and the evidence has definitely been used. However, I think there are concerns that there are some political decisions that may have been taken, not necessarily based on evidence. But I think overall we agree that there was a lot of use of evidence. And again, on the point of variations, I think looking at the examples given from South Africa, it's different from our situation here. In our case, for example, the decision of the scientific committee is overall. and guides everything. So for there's a lot of pressure because half of the schools in Uganda, for example, are owned by private individuals. And these are run on commercial basis. So there's a lot of drive and pressure and lobbying by the private owners to have the schools open. However, the scientific committee has recommended that given the nature of our schools, the congestion, the environment in which they are operating, it is not yet safe to open schools. So at the end of the day, despite the political interests and economic interests, if you like, the decisions, I think from the scientific committee are overruled. And so I thank all those who have supported and advanced arguments for the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. With your permission, Mr. Adjudicator, I'm going to ask Kwabena if he wants to just take a couple of minutes to make some of the points he was prevented from making. Are you there, Kwabena?
Yes, I'm here. Apologies, there was a small hitch-up. Apologies. Yeah, my submission is.
I'm going to just give you a couple of minutes, Kwabena, because
okay, please. All right, I'll be quick.
Sure.
Evidence, the use of evidence, the primary intent is to enhance achievement of results. The evidence across the continent clearly shows that something different has happened on the continent. Let me read a very small statement that was recorded by CNN from Melinda Gates, who is the co-chair of Bill and Melinda Gates. She said that Africa and developing countries he said COVID may exact a high death toll on Africa. She also indicated that the COVID situation in Africa might turn out as bad as the situation in Europe and China or the United States. She ended by saying she foresees bodies lying around in the streets of Africa, but the reality is different. My question is, what is the difference? Africa, at least for once, has depended on clear understanding what are the facts and the realities on the ground, on the basis of which communication, high-level communication, citizens' engagement has been guided by the real facts. You agree with me that communication as to what the disease is, mode of transmission, have been guided by scientific facts. Therefore, the 3-tier message, social distancing, washing of hands with soap and flowing water, and also the fact about wearing nose masks are scientifically driven. They are not based on perceptions. Africa, again, has come on differentiated approach in treatment and response to the disease. Let me give an example in Ghana. Ghana, at the beginning, realized that the disease was important, and the first strategy was to close the border. However, they realized that with the border closed, still there were evidence of the disease spreading. So the first thing they did was to study to understand the mode of transmission, the trends and whatever. And Ghana realized that there were 3 hotspots. Quickly, instead of doing a countrywide shutdown, it was a targeted shutdown to ensure that it contained the disease. That is one. Number 2, just yesterday, the Minister for Education was asked, when is the schools going to open? And I want to quote his statement. He said, the decision to open the schools will be based on available science and data. Consistently, the president of Ghana has backed his statement with fact and evidence, which is slightly different from what used to be. Clearly, you will see that even the social safeguards that have been put in place by government in Africa, especially in Ghana, has also been underpinned by evidence as to who needs food, when they need food, what type of food, and what other social measures they need. So to complement what my colleague has said, I said the low death rate or low mortality is evidence of the fact that something different has happened. Africa has been able to achieve beyond the expectation of the world, because the thinking was that Africa was going to be suffering more than even developed countries. Our health systems are fragile, we agree. But because of evidence-based decision-making, we've been able to optimize the little capability that we have and be responsible. In fact, we've achieved more than even our systems have yet not been overwhelmed. So clearly, I can end by saying, because I've lost time already, that Africa has used evidence, one, in sharing information. Africa has used evidence in responding to the disease. Africa has used evidence in providing social safety net. Africa has used evidence in creating the dynamics across the communities so that people are able to, on their own, respond adequately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwabena. That was a very fiery delivery of a powerful set of points. I'm going to give each Stella and Ibrahim a couple of, like a minute each to give your closing arguments. Can we start with Stella first?
Thank you, Dugan. I think I just want to say again in conclusion that precise analysis of COVID-19 in Africa is not, it's not complete. It's hindered by limited testing and reporting of cases. So as we know it, we do not have the correct data on COVID-19 in Africa. And so just to, sort of respond to what Kwabena has said, we do not have those figures. So it's not possible to give a precise analysis of what's happening on the ground. It is possible that there's a silent pandemic. And our demography and all the other factors might be covering up what's really happening, but I think that we should make that very clear. Going forward, I think what we have learned is that we need to get the basics right. So this continent has a high population that depends on the informal economy. Most of our people live in informal settlements. And when water and sanitation is like the basic first line defense mechanism against this virus, and a huge part of the population, a huge portion of the population cannot access those things, we have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what's important. We need infrastructure. Water and sanitation is critical. We also have to make use of the research and partnerships in innovations that's happening on this continent. Senegal came up with a testing kit that's under $1. It's still being in process, but in like the UK testing and all of that stuff, I wonder why we cannot do that on this continent. And so those are some of the things we can take advantage of to, going forward, to better adapt to local measures as the pandemic and the public perceptions also evolve. Thank you.
And Ibrahim.
Thanks. My first direct response to Kwabena about the claimed successes of disease control in Africa is that much of that is attributable to anecdote, not evidence. So whatever the CNN lady says, or whatever a whole range of other people say or make claims about, is based on anecdote, not evidence. That's the first point. The second point is that I'm going to contend and continue to contend that evidence has been abused, not necessarily used, to the extent that governments have made good decisions about lockdowns, about sealing borders, about some of the welfare interventions, and so on. These have been done in order to continue the legitimation of government, because in the absence of these kind of decisions, not all of them evidence-based, by the way, these decisions would simply have flied in the face of what the conventional wisdom, admittedly informed by science, not necessarily evidence, but science, because the evidence is not sufficiently clear on a whole range of things, including about the mutation of the disease and so on. So, in contradistinction to Trump's America, Africa and governments in Africa had to make, or were compelled to make these decisions because they relied wholly on the advice of the World Health Organization. Without taking those advisories into account, governments may well have found themselves toppled. Lastly, to the extent that evidence has been used, it's been used to extract the degree of compliance based on coercion and rather than consent. And so what you have is compliance-driven behavior, which is demanded through command and coercion not driven through getting the consent of people to be regulated. And in many cases, people consented to this regulation out of their own interest, not because governments were able to actually do something in terms of providing a sanction or punishment for non-compliance. And so people did so born out of their own interests as rational actors, rather than because of any fear of government or because of any good decisions being made by government.
Take that. Okay, now we want to hear from you. We're going to ask you to please, Talita's going to put the poll on the screen. We're going to ask you to vote which case you support. The for motion team, that yes, indeed, evidence has been effectively used to inform responses to COVID-19 across Africa, or to vote for the against motion, that evidence has not been effectively used to inform responses to COVID-19 across Africa. So please, will you complete the poll? Now would be a good time. You just need to click a box and press submit, and it will all go there. And while we wait for you to do that, I'm going to hand over to our adjudicator, who is going to start making his assessment. And while he does that, Talita will send him the findings of the poll. Over to you, Elia.
All right, thank you, Dogan. I would like to start by just thanking the two debating teams for making their arguments so eloquently and so strongly, and also for the input that we got from the participants. I think the question that is on the table: has evidence been effectively used? Have governments and other stakeholders used evidence effectively to respond to COVID-19? I think the main word there is effective, and I think in listening to both sides, it's very, very clear that we are looking at the COVID situation as really a very, very big challenge, development challenge, very, very big health crisis. But in a way, it's also a natural experiment that provides an opportunity to look at the extent to which government systems, scientists, and so on the continent are actually well placed to support decision-making, the extent to which evidence is actually being used. So it's like a natural experiment of sorts. It's a big opportunity, because when you look at COVID, this is an area where everybody out there wants to understand the facts. They want to understand how can I get this problem? How do I, even at grassroots level, how do I prevent it? If I get it, what will happen to me? So the evidence to inform people on the epidemiology, on the clinical aspects of COVID, the demand for that evidence is very, very high. And I think I would argue that that there's never been a time or a crisis that presented the importance of evidence in a way that COVID has done. Both sides have argued here that evidence has been used. So there's no question about evidence not being used. The question is, has it been effectively used? The group, the team arguing for the motion have gone on to say, countries have made very, very good responses. They did lockdowns. We've seen, in Uganda, how the government made decisions to do lockdowns, and then they started collecting local data to understand which groups are most risky groups and started targeting them. And the whole issue about how do you protect the poor, governments have taken decisions on social protection based on their understanding of who are the most vulnerable people. I think Kwabena came in late, but he made this a very, very strong argument as well, that the fact that Africa is actually the least affected of all regions of the world is evidence that the continent is doing something right. But I don't know whether you can go as far as saying, you know, this is really because of evidence use, that Africa has used evidence more than the other regions. I think so. That's a very clear argument. Governments have made decisions on what to do, and increasingly, governments have been making decisions on trying to protect the poor, looking beyond health on other socioeconomic aspects of the COVID. So when you look at really that's the core argument of the four group. When you go to the group that argued against the motion, they have also made very valid arguments. I think Stella came up and talked about how this has been a lost opportunity for the continent. The problem came late, but our response didn't act like we really took advantage of the time itself. There have been gaps there that have been highlighted, including the fact that not many African countries are doing enough testing to really understand the full extent of the problem itself. When you start looking at the gaps in evidence, I think even the gentleman, the first gentleman who spoke, I shouldn't be losing names here, even when Rubanga spoke first, Rubanga even came up and accepted that, yeah, there have been some areas where evidence use hasn't been optimal in informing decisions that governments have made. So it's been a lost opportunity in many respects, but I think the issue about which evidence has really been used there has come up as well. I think the whole issue about the political economy of evidence use, which has been highlighted by the against team, showing that they have made the arguments that motivations, evidence has been used where the motivations of the politicians have been very strong. Sometimes evidence has been used to justify decisions that politicians already have. We've been other cases like Tanzania, where the evidence has actually been challenged by the politicians to say we don't have COVID, or some sort of arguments like that. And evidence has been very unevenly used across the continent. And I think this point has been made quite strongly about the variability, the inconsistency of evidence used by the against team. But I think the issue about the political economy of evidence, the critical aspect that has been highlighted there, there's a question when we talk about evidence: has the evidence been there? And in cases where it's there, has it been effectively used? There are some places where evidence hasn't been there, especially when you look at the non-health aspects of COVID, the socioeconomic aspects where the evidence needed to be generated locally. Where the big decisions, lockdowns were made and so on, the decisions related to what you might call the emergency stage of the pandemic, that evidence mostly came from WHO. So evidence has been used, it was mainly global evidence. But when the need now came for more evidence to be used to show the local context, the epidemiology of the epidemic, who is really infected, the extent of the problem, how do we protect the vulnerable, the socioeconomic impacts and so on, I think it's been very clear in the debate that that evidence has not been there, or it has not been effectively used. But it also highlights the issue about even when you have evidence, there are people who challenge evidence, as I say, there are people who question the evidence, and if there's no motivation by the decision makers to make a certain decision, they can discard evidence that is on the table. So I don't know how much time I have on the table here, but I also wanted to take a look at the result before I pass my final judgment on what I see as the critical issue here. So what we see is that 69% have voted against the motion to say that evidence has not been effectively used, and we have 33% who have voted for the motion that evidence has been effectively used. I would like to say that I mean, in a court of law, it's not a court of law, but as a judge, I have to use some principles. You don't make a decision on the basis of a democracy. judges always hear the arguments on the two sides and the side that is talking against the motion on the table. And also you hear public opinion, what is in the newspapers and what people are saying about the case. So it's important to see that the public thinks this way. The good thing here is that all of you guys, it's a public of experts. And I think for me, while I think the group that voted for, debated on the four side, I should say that the group, maybe Kwabena's absence kind of affected the team a little bit, but the group got drowned to a very, very large extent. I think they even accepted in their own submissions that there are some areas where evidence hasn't been used effectively. And I would like to commend the group that argued against for the eloquent decision arguments that they made. The many examples, I think Stella, you made the point there that Africa is varied. Of course, there are different capacities in evidence use, but also the capacities of decision makers to absorb the evidence. So in totality, I think that it's very, very clear that evidence is being used, but much more can be done, that more local evidence can be there. We need to look at the socioeconomic aspects. We need to understand the pandemic much more by collecting more data. So I can only say here that not that I was influenced by the vote, but I'm on the side of the vote and on the side of the against group, and say that this motion carried the day today. Thank you. The against motion carried the day, not the motion carried the day. Thank you very much.
The against motion carried the day. Thank you, sir. That was a very diplomatic but very assured finding. Congratulations to Stella and Ibrahim, and condolences to Timothy and Kwabena. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the audience for your participation. So we're here to launch a book. The book is called Using Evidence in Policy and Practice, Lessons from Africa. It's a masterful work by Mina and Ian. It's been funded by the Hewlett Foundation very generously, and they've enabled an amazing amount of work to be done on the book. I'm going to hand over to Ian to take us through some of the highlights of the book, and then I'll be sure to be done by past. So over to you, Ian.
So thank you, Dugan, and thank you everybody for a very enjoyable debate. So first of all, just want to introduce you to the analytical framework which we used in the book. And then what I've been trying to do is to pick up from what everybody has said, including the speech from the Deputy Minister. What were some of the factors against this framework which we could identify? So first of all, one of the key issues around using evidence is the context, and whether the external context or the context of individual organizations. And this potentially leads to a demand from evidence. Of course, in this case, there's been a demand in relation to the crisis. Certain evidence has been generated. Certain things have been done to encourage use of that evidence. And that has triggered awareness, agreement, access to information, interaction or trust, which might or might not have led to motivation to use evidence, the capability to use evidence, and an opportunity to use evidence, which hopefully will have triggered evidence use. And we hope that that will then eventually have a development impact. So when we try to apply this to the discussion and the debate we've just had now, what do we see? So in terms of some of the factors which facilitated use, well, obviously the crisis itself and the need for answers, the need for contextually relevant responses, e.g. how do we deal with quarantine, how do we deal with testing, the fact that we had some international agreements and relationships, for example, with WHO, strong civil society, a degree of skills, expertise, and experience, some effective knowledge brokers, and Erin, I think, talked about science-based leadership. Well, the degree to which is an issue. Perhaps the motion that carried suggests not enough. Some of the barriers were slow responsiveness and reactivity to evidence, sometimes following too much models from the West, some contradictory policies, the desire for political power in politicians, sometimes the quality of evidence is weak, and state capacity. And we saw a variety of evidence that was actually being used. So in terms of the evidence generation, we saw some research provided by WHO, rapid research done on food issues, on hotspots, rapid evaluations, rapid research synthesis. The Deputy Minister talked about the COVID end assembling of research evidence around COVID, the evidence from citizens, for example, on police behavior. And then we heard a number of examples of data from border points, hospitals, mortality statistics, but also some of the challenges with that. For example, are people dying with COVID or from COVID? And then the point was raised, which relates to the point about quality and rigor, about how is evidence vetted. One of the key points that the book makes is about the fact that while we're often explicit about the need to generate evidence, we're not explicit about the type of evidence use interventions which facilitate the use of evidence. And that this is something we've got to become much more proactive about and much more purposive and reflective about. We heard some examples. For example, the mechanism of creating, or the change mechanism around interaction and trust. We heard examples of regular interaction, forums with advisory committees, forums with universities. In terms of building agreement, in the South African example, there've been negotiations through forums like NEDLAC. Tim talked about the National Task Force. In terms of trying to build abilities, there's been strengthening policymakers' understanding of what the health and economic realities are. And in terms of access, enabling convenient access to evidence. And we heard, of course, the preaching the message on social distancing, etc. But a warning that this was more focused on urban areas. So what do we see in immediate outcomes? We see departments assembling, in terms of changes in capability, the capability to generate and use evidence. We see one of the areas that was mentioned was the capability of departments to assemble evidence, to be able to share on international platforms, building joint capability, e.g. with CSOs. That there were changes in motivation. There was a motivation because we needed answers now. And that there was, but we also saw a change in some countries as the crisis strengthened to focus more on economic issues, perhaps, and not just the health issues. And that there was a stimulation of the opportunity to use evidence because of governments looking at what to do and trying to learn from African and wider experience. What sort of use did we see? So one of the things in the book, we talk about different types of use. We talk about instrumental, conceptual, process, and symbolic use. And we saw examples of instrumental use in terms of the use of masks, lockdowns, focus on borders, food parcels, or school closures. In terms of conceptual use, we've seen some conceptual use and building understanding about how the virus moves and who it affects, but there's still many gaps. We saw examples of process use, of deciding where to deploy police, or perhaps on holding government to account. And Ibrahim talked about some of the negative symbolic uses of policy-based evidence and abusing evidence. But perhaps also there's been a positive symbolic use, which I said, I think that compared to before this crisis, when the fake news debate was so strong, this crisis has really raised the profile of evidence, which is a positive symbolic use. So some of the learnings that have come from the book include that context matters, make sure you understand it. But the devaluation is a rational enterprise, or and evidence more generally is a rational enterprise that takes place in a political context. Evidence use is complex. It begins long before an evidence journey happens, and it needs to be planned for. We need to ensure there's demand for evidence and credibility, quality, and legitimacy in the evidence journey, and that evidence takes place in multiple ways. So some of the things we need to to do in terms of applying evidence use interventions is that passive provision of evidence doesn't work, and we need to have active facilitation and knowledge brokering. And we've seen a variety of organizations playing that role, whether it's national institutes of communicable diseases, or it's medical research councils, or it's some civil society institutions. We need formal structures to manage the process and maintain ownership of stakeholders. And we need to build the capacity of managers, decision makers, and stakeholders. And we need to package and communicate evidence simply and effectively, ensuring that evidence is relevant to policy concerns, providing practical and realistic solutions, being as specific as possible what can be done, but also recognizing that the values of recipients really influences the way evidence is used. And we need to make sure that the way evidence is presented is readable and accessible. There's also what came from the book is having an evidence system, e.g. a national evaluation system or NES, make some of the elements which favor evidence use automatic, and so is good practice. And several of the countries that have been part of this debate, including Uganda, Benin, South Africa, have got a national evaluation system. So lastly, in terms of the book itself, the book is, we've deliberately made sure that it's available across Africa. So there's an open access version that's available. And if you log on to the publisher's website, you can access the open access version. But of course, we would love you to buy one. And, but we're more interested in making sure there are many downloads than there are many that are sold. There are also going to be some future webinars on different chapters from the book. And the next one will be in September in French on using evidence for tobacco control in West Africa, a really interesting case. And we'll be continuing with these through to February. So do keep in touch with Talita and you'll know more about these future seminars. And just from my side, thank you for participating today. And with that, back to Dugan.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to Ian and Mina on the book. Thank you very much for the support that the Hewlett Foundation provided, which made the book possible. I want to thank Godfrey Mashamba for his speech, for speaking on behalf of the Deputy Minister. I'd like to thank Elia Zulu for his very statesman-like adjudication. I want to thank Kwabena and in particular Ibrahim for stepping in at the last minute. And I most of all want to thank our audience for their participation. It's really lovely to have you join us in our call. And finally, I want to thank the indomitable Talita Slaka for her endless work and for her wonderful facilitation of this event. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And please download the book. The link is in the chat box. And if you get an opportunity, please buy a hard copy because you'll cherish it and love it your whole life. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.